All right, welcome back to Racial and Ethnic Minorities. Um, it is August, this is the week of August 30th, September 1st, and September 3rd. So that's the Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of this week. And so the readings for this week, as shown in your syllabus, the readings are Short History of Race by George Frederickson, Souls of Black Folk, by Du Bois, Souls of White Folk, which is found, Souls of Black Folk is a book, Souls of White Folk is a chapter of a book called Dark Water, written by W.E.B. Du Bois, and then Racist America by Joe Fagan. So those are your readings for this week, and those are the readings that I am going to go over in this lecture. Okay. So if you go to the next slide, what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to, it's called racial categories. And in this slide, I'm going to pretty much introduce you to the concept and this idea around the social construction of race, right? And what that means. And so before we get started, what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to click on that YouTube link. And I would like for you to watch that YouTube link. It should be about maybe 5 to 7 minutes. And then we will go from there. And we will continue to talk about this notion of the social construction of race. All right, so if you watch maybe like the first between 5 and 6 minutes of this, you will see that what they're talking about is this idea of race as a social construction. Basically, the argument is that there is no biological basis for race, essentially, right? There's no biological basis for race. This is probably one of the most important concepts, or this is at least a foundational concept for how we're going to discuss race. Some people may argue that there is a biological explanation for race. I've not seen it or any strong argument to that effect, but it could be out there. But this is how we kind of start off this discussion, this conversation. Now, there are no subspecies or races in the human population that is based off of solely biology, meaning that there is not an inherent meaning for race, but race is something that changes over time, and that means something depending on the social context, depending on the social meaning of wherever you are. That determines the meaning of race. So race is not biological, but race is simply just a system of powers. It is a system of constraints. It is something that enhances the position of some people and disadvantages the position of other people. And so when we think about race, we realize that there are as many or more differences within races than between races. So, for example, if you all were to be in a room, and if the room was filled with people from varying racial backgrounds, it was filled with white people, Black people, Asian people, Latinx people, Native American people. And just like in the video, you ask somebody, well, who would you have more of a connection with genetically? It's likely that a person would assume, well, I would have more of a connection with somebody of my own racial group, right? But actually, if you were to cut open all of our bodies and look at all of our genes, you might find that there may be more similarities with you and a person that would identify with a racial group outside of yours than somebody who would identify with a racial group, with the same racial group as you. So we actually, a lot of times as human beings, have more in common than we do that separate us. It is just the things that do separate us are the things that society tends to harp on and tends to use as a way or as a means of assessing who should be in power, who should be in authority, and who should have access to what resources. So essentially, some people would argue that race is made up, right? It is a made up construct. And that's not necessarily the case. Race is not made up. Race is real. Race has real consequences. Even though it's not biologically real, it is socially real. And it produces real effects for people who are raised as Black or white or Native American or Latinx or Asian or whatever your racial group is. And so these effects can be some social effects. There could be economic effects. Race has kept people of color from occupying certain types of jobs, living in certain areas, attending certain schools. The social construct of race has been used to justify policies. We'll talk more about that when we talk about systemic racism and Joe Fagan's Racist America. It has been used to justify inequality and Jim Crow and segregation. And so it has also provided differences in the social status between white people and people of color. So it is seen as a way to justify what some people would just call the status quo. So when we say something is socially constructed, what we really mean is that the particular meaning attached to it is constructed by the people that are living in that environment, in that society. And that meaning can change, it can evolve, it can grow, depending on what time period it is, depending on if it's before or after a revolution, depending on if it's before or after a protest or a war. So the meaning of race in 1821 is different from what race means in 1921. And what race means in 1921 is much different from what race means in 2021. So if you identifying with a racial group, you would have much different experiences in those eras, right, in those years. And that's because race changes. So if we go to the next slide, what we see is something called the concept of race, Now, I think this is important because if we're going to talk about race throughout this entire semester, that I think it's important. Sometimes I don't give this reading, especially if it's like a theory class or something like that, but or even like an intro class, because we don't necessarily have to do a historical context around what race is. But since this is a race course, I do want us to go as far back as possible in how we discuss race. And what we end up finding, and this is actually what Du Bois says in Souls of White Folk, he says that race is actually a fairly new phenomenon. It's actually not that old of a social construct when you think about it, right? It's not as old as gender. I don't know about sexuality, and I don't know, I mean, I'm pretty sure you can, the idea of race and ethnicities and things like that has existed since biblical times, just like gender, just like sexuality. But in terms of how permanent and how much it permeates the lives of people in this world, that's very new. Probably the newest out of all of the constructs, now that I think about it. But like I said, I would have to think back to sexuality. That may be much newer in terms of how much it affects people. So I'm not sure. But regardless, it's a very new construction. And we say that because in the pre-colonial world, there was no concept of race. Before colonization, before the age of European expansion, before what some people would call the modern times, race didn't really exist. And this is what Fredrickson is arguing in this book, right? In the short history of race. Now, this does not mean that there was not stratification. There was absolutely stratification. There were absolutely labels, and there were social strata and a social status and meanings that existed all throughout, the history of the world. And there were divisions, right? So in the ancient world, a lot of Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, and Chinese people, Mesopotamians, while there is no evidence of race as a way in which the people were divided, people were absolutely divided in other ways. For example, the Greeks looked at people who were Greek as civilized and people who were non-Greek as barbarians. So that was their way of separating them. So it didn't really have much to do with race as opposed to doing maybe your ethnicity or what country you were born in, right? Especially if you think about it, Greeks and Romans, all these people in Europe, everybody who they're coming in contact with look a lot like them in terms of their race, in terms of their color. They're not really coming in contact consistently with people of varying racial groups. Now, of course, there was trade between Greeks and Egyptians and people in the southern part of in Africa and all of that. Also trade going on in China and all these other places. So they absolutely know that there are people, some people know, because most people don't even participate in those trades. But if you were an explorer, then you would. So they knew that. But in terms of everyday interaction, no, they're interacting with people of their same, what we would call racial group. However, they divided people based on where you were born. So if you weren't born where I was born, then you're seen as uncivilized, right? So these ideas were not, again, based on race, ethnicities, or skin tone. So one was civilized if they were born where you were born, or if they lived in a city state, if they lived in a big urban area, right? Barbarians tended to live in more rustic environments. They were seen as less democratic, tended to live in rural areas. They were farmers. So people who lived in the city kind of looked down on them as being dirty and stinky because they were always working with animals and working in farms. They weren't in the cities buying clothes, going to the schools and being a part of the politics in the city. So that was a way that people were divided, okay? Irish and Slavic people were seen as uncivilized savages and in need of colonization because of their way of life, according to the Greeks. But if you were to ask what is the race of Greeks, Irish, and Slavic people, somebody would say they're all white. So in early times, there was no division based on race. There were divisions based on these other, right, like social identities. And because of these divisions, certain people could not rise to levels of power. They couldn't intermarry with civilized people, etc. Another thing that people think about when they think about race automatically in the US context is they think about slavery. And that's understandable, right? When you think about slavery, Jim Crow, racism, those types of conversations and those elements all kind of get mashed into one discussion. But slavery did not start with the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery didn't start with African people being kidnapped and brought to the United States. All right. But slavery was has been a part of the ancient world, was a part of the ancient world for a long time, ever since the biblical times, right? So slavery's always been a thing. The difference is it was a different kind of slavery, right? So what you see in the transit, and this is what Du Bois talks about this as well, and so is the white folk. The extent to which slavery and inequality existed with the transatlantic slave trade and subsequently Jim Crow, segregation, and the rise of the United States as a superpower is far greater, far greater than any type of slavery, any type of inequality that was done in the past. So while modern day white people, Europeans, Westerners, after the age of European expansion, it can't be said that they created slavery or they created indentured servitude or they created inequality. They definitely expanded on it in a way that far exceeded what anybody had ever seen in any time in Earth's history. And so when you think about slavery, and if race wasn't an issue in pre-colonial times, if people didn't really have a concept of race, then the question would remain, then how were people enslaved? Well, they weren't enslaved based on their race. They were typically enslaved based on their based on geographic expansion. So if my country took over your country, then if I win, we enslaved your people. So, and then you were considered a barbarian if you were not a part of my people, you were part of your people. And this was very different than the transatlantic slave trade. And now again, the difference is if my people took over your people, and then I enslaved your people, typically it was only done for a short amount of time. It was rare that slavery was something that existed forever and ever and ever, and then passed on to your children and your children's children and your children's children. There were almost still some kind of moral standards around slavery, because it only existed so that you can build up your empire. Once your empire was built, then I'm not going to make you continue to be a slave, because they understood that there was something immoral about it. But people are greedy, so they do those types of things. But it's like, well, you will be a slave for 7 years or 10 years. And then in many societies, after you were enslaved for 7 or 10 or servant for 12 years, once that time is over, you could actually be reinstated into that society. Sometimes you can go back to your original home, or you could stay in that society and be an actual citizen and grow and be a leader. Sometimes you could do that, right? There were definitely some societies where that happened. But with the transatlantic slave trade, it wasn't that way. And that was very, very new. It was something that was much more horrendous than what we had seen in the past. Another key point that Fredrickson brings up is that while there was no such thing as race specifically in the ancient world, the ways in which people manipulated religion as a form of social stratification was what helped set the stage for the concept of race and racism. And this is what I think Fredrickson does a really good job of in explaining. So prior to Christianity and the scientific revolution, in the ancient world happenings and life explanations were based on the beliefs of gods and supernatural powers. So after the development and expansion of the world's most popular belief systems like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and then some other belief systems like Buddhism and Hinduism, people began to conquer lands and territories, and they used religion as a conduit for material gain. So the ancient world was extremely religious, very much religious. And although a lot of these religions got their start in like Southwest Asia and Africa, Europe started to adopt a lot of these traditions and a lot of these religions. And then they would adopt them and then they would democratize them, because initially, many of these religions and these people had to flee in order to practice their beliefs. Whether you're talking about Muslims fleeing Mecca to go to Medina, or whether you're talking about Christians who had to flee from one part of Southwest Asia to another part in order to flee persecution from Saul, who would eventually be Paul, right? These people were fleeing in order to escape persecution. But as they were escaping and fleeing, people started joining their ranks. People started joining Christianity. At first, they were called followers of the way. After Jesus died, they were called followers of the way. And then later on, they were dubbed Christians, right? And so people, as it began to grow and develop, the bigger kings and queens and emperors started to adopt these same religions. And when they adopted these religions, they democratized it. They made it more acceptable to the people, and then use that as a way of conquering other groups. And so what they would do is oftentimes they would set out to convert Europeans and non-Europeans all across the world. They would go out and they would take over areas, and they would say, hey, if you become a Christian, or if you become a Muslim, or whatever the religion is, then you can have a certain level of freedom, right? You'll have certain, but if you don't, then you'll be our slave and you get treated worse. So sometimes they would use that as a way to just make people be whatever their religion is, right? And so this was done all throughout the Western world, all throughout, well, it was the Eastern world at that time. And so that's how people started to get to know one another through that and through trade, and got to know people of various racial groups, even though most of the time, most people only interacted with people inside their racial group. And so this is when you had Europeans who came into contact with Africans, and Africans who came into contact with Europeans. Now, there is a lot of research to show and suggest that Europeans would come into Africa, certain parts of Africa, and they would conquer them. And sometimes they would make them convert to Christianity. Other times, and many times they didn't have to, because Christianity became institutionalized in Northern Africa before it was institutionalized in Europe. But then there were other times in which just missionaries would come out and they would try to convert people. And we know that racial tensions wasn't a big deal, because when these Europeans would go to North Africa, when they would go to certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and when they would try to convert these Africans, if they were successful, they saw that as confirmation that their faith and their spirituality spoke to the equality of all human beings. So to be able to convert people that were very, very different from them proved that this religious outlook was truly godly, and that it was truly moral, and that it brought a sense of oneness to the people, to people from all walks of life. So the conversion of African people, or the conversion of people outside of one's, what we would call racial group now, was highly celebrated. It was highly celebrated. And so religion, again, was a major part. Religion and spirituality was a major part of the ancient world, particularly if you were a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. Now, while there were people who may have accepted differences, a lot of people did not. A lot of people didn't accept these differences. And if we go to the next slide, we see that there was a lot of evidence of early anti-Judaism. Sometimes we call it anti-Semitism. And basically what that is a hatred or ill feelings toward Jews that were found in the early Christian church. Now the question is, why do you think so many of these Christians had this animosity towards the Jews? Why did the Christians hate the Jews so much? After thinking about it, you may come to the conclusion that one of the reasons why was because Jews were seen as the Jesus killer. Y'all were the one that killed Jesus. Y'all were the ones that said it was okay for Jesus to die. And so they looked at Jews as the killer of the founder and leader of the Christian group. Now, at the same time, although Jews were looked at by Christians as the people who killed Jesus, if you do your, if you know your research, if you know your biblical history and anything like that, then you'll see that at the same time, Jesus himself was a Jew. And not only was Jesus a Jew, but a lot of the foundings, a lot of the teachings, where did it go? A lot of the teachings of Jesus was based on Jewish principles and Jewish history. Whether you're talking about Moses and Abraham, and David, all of these early founders of Christianity were Jewish people. So while there was a lot of Christians that did not like Jews, they also felt like they had to have a certain level of respect for the Jews and couldn't necessarily see them as inherently evil. Because if you see them as inherently evil, then you have to think about yourself as inherently evil, because Christianity comes out of the Jewish tradition. All right, it's almost like disliking your brother or hating your brother or sister or cousin or whatever. You can have beef with somebody in your family, but can you say that their blood is inherently evil? Well, no, because your blood is their blood. So there's some boundaries around that type of tension. And so when we look at that, this allows us to make distinctions between Judaism or anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and racism. Because anti-Judaism just simply says, well, there was animosity towards Jewish history and Jewish beliefs. But if we can convert these people, then problem solved. That's how the Christians looked at it. Then there's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism says, no, it's not just about conversion. We have this very consuming hatred of Jews. And we would prefer to just get rid of them. I don't want to convert them. I want them to be off the face of the earth. That's anti-Semitism. And then racism says, no, it is the belief that Jews were intrinsically evil, that these people had an evil inside of them that could not come out. And so that's essentially that's a part of racism. It's to believe that a certain group is intrinsically inferior, intrinsically evil. And racism towards the Jews, again, was not that they were just people with false beliefs, but biologically, they were immoral. And so what you see in the 12th and 13th centuries, we see that the attitudes that early Christians had towards Jews started to become more and more hostile. It started with more anti-Judaism, and then it started to grow. And so a lot of race scholars don't necessarily label this still as racism per se. Because while this hatred did grow, there still isn't this belief that they have this inherent immorality to them. But what it does do, what race scholars do say, is that this does help human beings lay the foundation for racism. Because if we can start to hate people based on these things, and then you do that for a couple hundred years, you just start to create a way for this to be done in bigger and bigger ways, and in different ways. So this would later develop into racism, which would lead to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the demonization of Jews, it was based on certain myths. Myths that were used to demonize the Jews. One was that Jews crucified Christian children for ritual purposes, or that Jews required Christian blood for sacred ceremonies, or that they stole and tortured the consecrated host from Christian churches. And so this propaganda and these myths made it easier for people to accept this preconceived notion that Jews were evil, or that Jews were doing evil things. And so because of that, Jews were seen as the scapegoats. Something bad happened in society, even when it wasn't their fault. Oh, it's because of those Jews. So typically, if you look down at a certain person or a certain group of people, it's easy to label them the scapegoat when something happens. It's easy to label them the cause of whatever the situation is. That's the same thing that happened in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler, and he wasn't the first one. It was people before him that laid the foundation. But anti-Semitism started with the Jews being looked at as the cause of World War I and the subsequent devastation of Germany and large unemployment of Germans after World War I. And so because of these stereotypes, Jews weren't seen as humans. Something we're going to talk about later with Fagin's work, the dehumanization is the psychological foundation for racism. You have to first not see somebody as human. We get that from Fagin. We also get that from Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So when you take the humanity away from somebody, it becomes a lot easier to marginalize them and exploit them. And then when you're done with that, you can exterminate them. And so this is what was done to the Jews for centuries. And throughout this semester, we're going to look at how race and racism becomes this vehicle for dehumanization, and not only how it applies to Jews, but also how it applies to people of African descent and Native Americans and Latinx people, etc. So this notion of dehumanization, we see that here in the demonization of Jews. Still not racism. Definitely discrimination, definitely hatred, definitely tension, but still not racism. And then what we start to find is that there is, as we move from the 12th and 13th century and we move closer to the age of European expansion, we start to see that these ideas around social differences, at this time based on religion, but then would eventually be transferred to being based on race, it starts to develop and grow. We see that Jews become the scapegoat, particularly during this, I think it was the bubonic plague or the Black Plague in Europe. Come to find out, it wasn't the Jews' fault. But because they were already looked down upon, because they were already discriminated in society, something happened that was out of their control, but they were automatically blamed for it. It's almost as if you were, I don't know if in your families, if you knew that there was always a brother or a sister or a cousin that would always, this was the problem child. Every family had the problem child. This was the kid that got in trouble all the time. Maybe it was you. Maybe you were the kid that got in trouble. And so if you're the kid that got in trouble in the family or maybe in the classroom, when something happened, automatic, oh, it must have been him or it must have been her. Typically that happens, even if the person says, but I didn't do it. A lot of people still don't believe them because they're automatically deemed as the problem child. So this is how it was with the Jews. And this continued to grow as Catholic Europe continued to expand. So we're on the next slide. Expansion leads to superiority. As Catholic Europe started to expand and colonization became more rampant, you start to see the attitudes of superiority, the attitudes of entitlement growing in Europeans. And this entitlement characterized the colonization of Asia and Africa and the Americas. You start to see how the Native Americans are now being taken over. People of other countries are now being taken over. But why is this still not considered racism? It's not considered racism because race or racism is a worldview, it's an ideology that is used to justify these practices. So there was no set cosmology that was used by people of power to justify these attitudes. And especially wasn't applied to the entire world. Yes, it was hatred, yes, it was discrimination, but it still wasn't racism. Racism is very different. And until the belief that this infidelity and this evil was organic in the blood of these people, these attitudes still would not be considered racist, but it does lay the foundation for it. And I think that's what Fredrickson is trying to show here. This religious tension and the acceptance of this religious tension and religious discrimination was what made people be okay with that. And then if they're okay with that, then they're okay with it on a higher level. So medieval Europe was very intolerant to all people who did not share their same beliefs, but Jews, they got the brunt of this hatred. And so we talked about earlier, a couple slides ago, and now we're on the slide that says contact with Africans, that there was this relationship, right, that early Europeans and Africans had with each other. And some people would argue that race was part of the ancient world. And if so, then we would see racism between Europeans and Africans. But that wasn't necessarily the case. Europeans had been coming into contact with sub-Saharan Africans even before the 1600s. Before 1619 was when, it's seen as when the first enslaved person, not the first African, but the first African as an enslaved person came to the Americas. But Europeans have been coming to Africa for a long time before that. And their interaction with them varied. Sometimes there was war, sometimes they had beef, sometimes it was to trade so that both groups could blossom and expand. Sometimes it was friendships, right? So if race was an issue during that time, then there would be these polarizing ideas around these groups of people. However, there is much evidence to show that Europeans not only prided themselves on converting African people to Christianity, but also looked to African people as almost kind of like godlike figures. There were definitely some examples of Europeans who had pictures of Black nativity scenes. And you can see this actually if you go to Europe. I've been there. And I've been to the museums in Paris. Well, yeah, I did go to the museum in Paris, and I've been to the ones in London as well. And they have these, and definitely if you go, I've never been to the ones in Italy, but if you go to the ones in Italy, you'll see where they have pictures and images of Black nativity scenes. Ethiopia was seen as one of the headquarters of the early Christian church. So they have pictures of Black Christian leaders, Black Christian apostles, Prester John, Ethiopia, early depictions of Jesus as a darker skinned man, Saint Gregory the Moor, all of these examples of elevated Black images. And so this is evidence that the belief that Black was inherently evil or bad became a worldview after the concept of race. It was after the Portuguese invasion on West Africa, which was essentially the start of the transatlantic slave trade. So according to Fredrickson, the first real evidence of a people equating Blackness with servitude in Iberia, which is like right below Spain and Portugal, was around this time. Another part of this conversation that many people don't talk about when they're talking about race and religion is the Arab slave trade. The Arab slave trade probably, did precede the transatlantic slave trade about maybe several hundred years. The Arab slave trade was definitely happening. And these were people who were of a darker skin. Some lighter, some darker, right? But this preceded the transatlantic slave trade. But it was something different with the transatlantic slave trade that helped to create this idea of race. And we see that around the time the Europeans were beginning to enslave the Africans, this was around the same time they stopped enslaving Europeans. So you see that Arabs enslaved both Black and white people because the Arab slave trade was like, oh, we taking everybody. It don't matter. If you're not Arab, then you're seen as a barbarian and you can be enslaved. But as the transatlantic slave trade started to expand, and as this idea of race started to come about, now even the Arabs are saying, oh, well, we'll take the Blacks over the whites. And then even when they did have both Blacks and whites, the Blacks tend to have gotten more menial tasks than the white people did. So you see evidence of it, but it wasn't quite, again, it's a slow burn. Race is a very slow burn that took centuries and centuries and centuries. Soon it became wrong to enslave other Christians. And with Christianity being so prevalent in Africa, because that's one of the first places that Christianity went, it became a lot easier to dehumanize these African people in another way. And so according to Fredrickson, skin color was mainly used as an identification and not really as a reason to hate. Even when it came to the Americas, because Europeans who came to the Americas enslaved each other first. Then they enslaved Native Americans, but that didn't work because Native Americans knew the land better than the white people did. So they would just run away and you could never find them. So they were like, well, who do we get? No, then they tried to enslave, and enslave the Native Americans. They tried to enslave Hispanic people, I think it was like in South America. And there was a man by the name of Bartolome de las Casas. And he was the one that convinced the Europeans, hey, go get the Africans. Number one, they're dark skinned, so you'll be able to see them if they run away. Number two, they're used to the heat, right? Because it's very hot in sub-Saharan Africa. And number three, these people have been running civilizations for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, and they know the land. They're literally students of the land. So if you want to build up your empire, you need to get them. So, okay. So it had nothing to do with race. It wasn't that they thought Black was inferior, at least at the time. It was because they needed a group of people that they could use and exploit to help build this empire. Now, based on the enslavement of East African kingdoms, who were largely Christians, and also with capitalism and mercantilism preceding racism, it was convenient that Africans became a large labor source around the exact same time that Europe began to colonize two large Western continents. So American history may argue a little bit differently than how Frederickson argues in this text, but we can see that capitalism did precede racism. And racism was used as a way to justify the continued capture of African people for the slave trade, right? So first you have the capitalism, first you have this greed and this need for resources, this need for free labor. And then after that, you say, well, how can we make this continue? Because we don't want to let this go. This is making us too much money. Well, now we will create something called race and racism, where we will say, well, these people are inherently inferior. These people are supposed to be here. They're made by God to be slaves and blah, 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 blah. And that's how you get racism. And so if we look at this tribal map of Africa, what we see, and I always think this is very important to look at, what we see is we see a picture. You can click on it. You can pause this until it comes up. But you see a picture of a map of Africa that is made up of all of these different kind of circles and shapes. And this is how Africans looked at Africa. A place filled with hundreds and thousands of different tribes and languages and religions and traditions. This is also how Turtle Island, or what we might call the United States, America, originally called Turtle Island, this is how the Native Americans looked at it. All the, it's just big, it's too many people. Too many people, too many languages, too many communities. There's no way you can conquer a place with so many cultural variances. And so in order to conquer people like this, you first have to generalize them. You first have to put them all under one name, one identity, one category. You call them one thing. What's the one thing all these people have in common? It's not their religion, it's not their language, it's not their tradition, it's not, but they're all dark skinned. So let's call them Black. Then you create a world concept like race that links them all together and then gives you the credence to say, well, because of this, because they are a part of this category, we're going to use this as a reason to justify their enslavement, their subjugation, and their purpose for living, which is to help expand who God really wants to be in charge, which is white Europeans, white Americans, manifest destiny. And so that is how our current understanding of race was created. So now if you were to look at a current map of Africa, you see something completely different. Look like puzzle pieces, and you can pull it up. Looks like puzzle. You know what Africa looks like. like they put puzzle pieces, and they're much larger. They're not small like how this map is. They're a lot larger. That happened after colonization. Prior to colonization, Africa looked like that. Prior to the slave trade, Africa looked like that. And so labeling these people one race and then using race to justify their enslavement and their subjugation leads to how we come to the concept of race. And that's why I think this is important. This is an important book to first start off the semester with. All right, so now we will go to Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk. Let's see. All right. So Du Bois. Du Bois is extremely significant when we're talking about when we are introducing race and the concept of race. You can't talk about, well, we talked about the concept of race on a global scale, and now we're making this more concentrated and bringing it more towards our understanding, our context in the US context. And the first person to ever scientifically study race as a context in which to understand larger meanings like class and economics and social interaction and politics, religion, was W.E.B. Du Bois. Nobody looked at race like he did before he did it, and after him, everybody copied him. That's why if you're going to be a race scholar, Du Bois and Souls of Black Folk is absolutely necessary for your library. It's a part of the race canonical standard. And just to give you a little bit of background on Du Bois was, I think was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was born free man. I think he was born in 1865. I think that's when he was born. But he was born a free man. He was very light, but he was identified as Black. Very intelligent, bright brother. Eventually he moved to and went to Fisk University to go to college during Reconstruction. And then he graduated from Fisk. And if you read things that he says, he very much enjoyed his historically Black college experience. Then after that, he went to Harvard University, where he got his Ph.D. He also studied overseas in Europe. I think he studied in Germany. That's where he started to come into contact with people like Weber, and he started to come into contact with sociologists and began to play around with this new budding discipline, sociology. And so he goes over there, comes back, he finishes his studies at Harvard. He didn't really have a great time at Harvard because he experienced a lot of racism, because he was the first Black person to graduate from Harvard with a PhD. So he experienced a lot of racism. He really didn't like it much. But he finished, got his PhD in history. And then he did a study, I think it was part of his dissertation, but he did a study on the experiences of Black people in Farmville, Virginia. Did that. Then he took kind of those same ideas and expanded on it. And he did a study called the Philadelphia Negro. He got funding and did a study on the Philadelphia Negro about the experiences of Black people in this urban capital and how Black people lived. How Black people lived, how they looked at the world, how the world looked at them, how they understood the society in which they lived, and how these larger structural factors, so this was done in the 1890s, how these larger structural factors were affecting the way that they were able to navigate society. Nobody had ever done this before. Nobody had ever looked at Black people, right, as a part of kind of like this scientific experiment to understand what they were going through and how what they were going through can speak to whether we were truly living in a democracy or not. So he does a study, he finishes the study, it's a success, it's amazing. He revolutionizes well, we don't have to go into that part, but he revolutionizes the methods of social science. He takes those same ideas from Philadelphia Negro, and then he writes Souls of Black Folk, which is the first really major piece on race to be written in the 20th century. I think it was published in 1903. Okay. And so when he writes Souls of Black Folk, this is how he starts it off. To the real question, how does it feel to be the problem? He's talking to Black people. He's saying that Black people are asking, why did God make me an outcast? These are people that feel like strangers in their own house. These are people that are just as American as everybody else. He even starts off Souls of White Folk in the same way. He starts off Souls of White Folk by saying, I don't write to you as a foreigner. I write to you as a native, meaning I am American. This is who I am. I'm just as American as everybody else, but yet, like these other Black folk, I am part of the Souls of Black Folk. I also feel like a stranger in my own house, but you won't make me, because this is where I belong. And so this is the central focus of the question about why is the Black man, the Black woman in America, why are they the problem? Why are they seen as a problem? Why are they treated as a problem? And then sometimes, why do they look at themselves as a problem? And then if they're not the problem, what is the real problem? So Du Bois problematizes these people. He problematizes their experiences to get a better understanding of what is really causing the conditions of this underclass, this racial proletarianization, what he calls it, or the proletarianization of a race, this underclass that is created by these larger social factors. And so what he finds in the Philadelphia Negro and what he writes in Souls of Black Folk is that these people have a gift. He calls it the veil. And what he says is that these people live in a world that yields him no true self-consciousness, only allows him to see himself through the revelation of the other world. Meaning they don't really have an understanding of who they are because, number one, that was stripped from them because of slavery. So generations and generations ago, their own true self-consciousness, a place where they can belong. If you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're a psychologist, you know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a place of origin is extremely important, a place where you belong. But these people are, forgot the term, but essentially these people are displaced people, and they've been displaced for a long time. Now, technically they belong to America, but they're not treated like that. So they're not treated in their home, but then if they go back to what is considered their home, they're Africa, they don't know anything about that. So they're displaced, they have no true self-consciousness. And then the home in which they're supposed to be in won't allow them to have that. It only allows them to see themselves as Black people through the eyes of Jim Crow, through the eyes of racism, through the eyes of subjugation. I'm not allowed to be anything else. And so while this is a burden, he says, and anybody else can understand that, your question might be, well, why is that a gift? That doesn't sound like something that should be considered a gift. But he says, yeah, it can be. Now, going back before talking about a gift, this idea of having to see yourself through the eyes of multiple people is why a white male who goes outside and it's raining may come back inside, might get an umbrella, or he might get a hoodie, and he might put the hoodie over his head and walk outside to go wherever it is he needs to go. Right? But a Black boy in that same position may not get an umbrella, he may get a hoodie, but before he puts on that hoodie, even if he decides to, has to think, wait a minute, how is somebody gonna look at me? Once it stops raining and the sun comes out, if I'm still wearing this hoodie, where do I have to walk? Am I gonna be around white people? What kind of white people am I gonna be around? And what are they gonna think if they see me in this hoodie? And what if the police come? All of these things are going through his head that didn't go through the white boys or the white male's head. That's because Du Bois is saying there's this other kind of consciousness that exists inside of the black folks, the souls of black folk that don't exist inside of the white folks. He calls it on the next slide, he calls it double consciousness. He's saying it's always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. So it's this way of looking at the world where you have to see not only yourself, but then also how are you going to see me? And it's something that he says in general, white folks then and even white folks now don't really have to worry about. They don't have to worry about what society thinks of them in general. Black people, women have to think about that. There's probably very few times where a male puts on some clothes and has to worry about if he's going to get sexually harassed. Not to say it's never happened, but probably not a lot. But women have to think about that constantly. That's a double consciousness. Same way with race. Black people, people of color in general, have to think about how am I going to be looked at? How am I going to be viewed if I talk like this, if I act like this, if I wear this, if I say this, if I take this job, all the time. And so essentially what he says is what this does to the black folks is this causes them to look at themselves as kind of this bifurcated being. They're American and they're Negro, or they're American and they're African. They're these two souls, these two different thoughts, right? He calls them unreconciled strivings. And they're always in battle with each other all the time. They're always negotiating with each other all the time. So much so that, and it's done so much that many times they don't even realize they're doing it. But they're always in battle with each other all the time. It's almost like, I don't know if you've ever seen like cells or something moving under a microscope, but that's how it is all the time. And they're at war with each other in this body, this dark body, that he says only the strength of who that person is, only their humanity keeps them from just being ripped apart. Because they're constantly at war with each other. Am I American? Am I Negro? Am I American? Am I Black? Do I do this or do I do that? A good example would be standing for the flag. That's a really good example. Because for a white person, standing for the flag means something consistent. It means that they're from this country, but it also means that they're treated like they're from this country. So it's something they can be proud of if they just look at their own experiences. It's something that they can be proud of because there are very few things that has happened to them. And there's nothing that has happened to them as a group, but there's very few things that have happened to them personally that will make them see this flag as something that is hypocritical or something that can be negative or represent something that can be negative. But Black people have a much different experience. So whether to stand for the flag or to not, we know the history and Kaepernick and why he stood, and some people believe and some people believe you should, some people believe you shouldn't, whatever. I'm not telling you either way. But what I'm saying is this is what Du Bois is getting at. He's getting at why Black people grapple with something like that. Why they have this double consciousness, while white people can have a singular consciousness of seeing it and it's consistent with their reality. Black people have this symbol, but then they have a reality. They have a symbol of freedom, a symbol of equality, but then they also experience oppression and inequality, both in the past and in the present day. So then they say to themselves, man, should I stand for the flag? Should I appreciate the flag? Or should I not? And then you have some people who go one way, some people who go another way. Just depends on the person. But that is essentially the unreconciled striving that oftentimes white people don't have to go through. And so if you look up double consciousness and the rebirth of double consciousness, you start, because this is of course written in 1903. So now Blackness and humanity is much more dynamic. So you have all different types of people. And now you can apply double consciousness to gender. You can apply it to sexuality. You can apply it to so many different other identities and ways of life. That's what makes this theory so powerful. And so Du Bois says, what these people have done. So he collected interviews, he did statistical analysis, he did historical analysis, and he said, what these people have done, and this kind of sets the stage for his book, Black Reconstruction, is that when they were given the opportunity for freedom, as soon as they had the opportunity for freedom after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment was passed, he says they immediately start to participate in this democracy, immediately, because they believe in it. And one of the first things they did, they said, listen, we got to vote. We got to vote. If we can vote, and if we can vote the right people in office that represent our interests, then we will surely be free. We'll surely have equality. Because right after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan started in Tennessee. The first wave. The second wave started in Atlanta, Georgia. Stone Mountain, Georgia. Atlanta, Stone Mountain. And that was one of the key movements, one of the key organizations, one of the key, riotous groups that stopped and continued to stop Black people from voting, not only on the grassroots level, but on a federal level for almost another century. So then Black folks said, well, if we just get an education, then we'll definitely be equal. Then we can show white people, and we can prove to white people that we can get an education, we can contribute to society, and we're not these inferior, uncivilized mongrels. And that's what they did. They got an education, started their own schools, showed that they could be civil human beings, but still didn't work. And so then Du Bois says, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the bottom of hardships. He's adding an economic component to this conversation. And he's saying, why, if I'm poor in a land that's already poor, yeah, that's difficult. If you're poor in Madagascar at one point was considered the poorest country in the world, well, that's understandable. You live in a poor country. But if you're not a poor man, you're a poor race. If your whole race is poor, not only poor, but you're poor in a land that's overflowing with resources and overflowing with wealth, there's something totally different. There's something immoral. There's something even worse about that. If you're poor in a land that's poor, then that's just the hands you were dealt. If you're poor, your whole race is poor in a land of dollars, that's not just dealt a poor hand. It was structured that way. It was contrived that way. And that's a problem. That's the system. And so when he concludes Souls of Black Folks, he's saying we can't blame these people for being quote unquote backwards. We can't blame them for being an underclass. We can't blame them for being largely educated. They're largely educated, they're underclass, they're a poor race, not because they want to be, not because that's how they're born or in any other situation they would still be that way. It's because you made them that way. It's because you created systems of slavery, systems of inequality, systems of Jim Crow and segregation. You created them uneducated, you created them poor, and you keep them that way. And so because you keep them that way, you can't ask them to race with the rest of the world. And you haven't given them time to solve their own problems. Yes, you got rid of the slavery chains, but then you put on segregation chains. And they still didn't have the same opportunities as everybody else. So they can't be asked to race with white people. They can't be asked to race with Native Americans or race with Asian people or race with the European or race with any other group until you actually offer them real equality and real freedom. And then you give them time to solve these social problems that have been plaguing them since they were enslaved. And once you do that, then you can now adjust and now you can say, okay, now how can they fit with running with the rest of the world? So Du Bois really breaks this thing down and really sets up the stage for how race is also a part of these social constructions. Marx and Weber does a really good job with class, but they don't look at race. And Du Bois says, well, race is a part of these constructions. And once he writes this, now it opens up the door for gender to be part of the social construction. Now it opens up the door, and now we can really start to expand this discipline called sociology. So, and also with Du Bois's work, this piece is evident and is significant not only in African American studies work. This is a piece that is very significant in anthropology work. This is a piece that is significant in sociology, everywhere. Okay, so hopefully that breaks down Souls of Black Folk. What I would like for you to do is I would like for you to watch this video. It's called The Unequal Opportunity of Race. Okay, so I want you to watch this video, and then I want you, for your class assignment, it's called The Unequal Opportunity of Race. I want you to answer these questions. I want you to answer them on a separate document, and I want you to upload that document to the class assignment portal that says The Unequal Opportunity of Race. Now, I want to see really good answers. I want to see you really thinking. That's how I'm going to grade you on, not just, any answers, not just something that I can tell you kind of typed up at the last minute. Even if you did type it up at the last minute, make it sound good. Okay. Submit it through the portal entitled The Unequal Opportunity of Race. And then your deadline for the response is September 3rd at 1 p.m. Okay, that's the deadline. So September 3rd would be Friday. So this is the lecture for August 3rd, September 1st, and September 3rd. So Friday at 1 p.m. Now, Souls of White Folk. Souls of White Folk, he talks about Souls of Black Folk, he writes that in 1903. Then he writes Dark Water, and Dark Water is just a collection of essays. So I'm not really sure exactly when he wrote Souls of White Folk. But based on what he's saying, you can get a kind of a general idea. You can tell before what he wrote it after, which we're getting ready to talk about in a second. But in Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois analyzes race and places African Americans under this kind of microscope of social science. So he's looking at how these people operate, navigate social life, etc. In Souls of White Folks, Du Bois becomes the first scholar to really analyze whiteness and white people as a racial group. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever done that before Du Bois. And we know when it was done, it had to be sometime post-World War I, probably very close after World War I when he wrote this. And in Souls of White Folk, Souls of Black Folks, he's talking to Black people, but he's also talking to white people about Black people, because he knows that a majority of Black people that were largely uneducated, I don't like saying uneducated, informally educated, probably wouldn't read the book. So he's talking to Black people about Black people, but he's largely talking to white people about Black people. And Souls of White Folk, though, he's talking to white people about white people. And it's a very good mix between, if you're taking my sociological theory class, or if you are taking it, we talk about David Walker's Appeal versus Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And this is a nice symbiotic relationship between the two. Very, very brave, very strong words, but he fluffs it up in this nice kind of scholarly academic language. So we're gonna look at this right now. So we know that this is a response to World War I, and what Souls of White Folks is doing, he starts off by talking about what race was in the ancient world, what race was prior to colonization and European expansion. So he says at the bottom of page 21, the discovery of personal whiteness among the world's people is a very modern thing, a 19th and 20th century matter. Indeed, the ancient world would have laughed at such a distinction. The Middle Age regarded skin color with mild curiosity, and even up into the 18th century, we were hammering our national mannequins into one great universal man with fine frenzy, which ignored color and race even more than birth. So basically what we talked about when we talked about Fredrickson, race wasn't a thing. We already went over that, so we don't have to go over that in more detail. But he was like, it was ignored. I already talked about that for real. Even more than birth. And birth was a thing for sure. Where you were born was big, but even your race was even more insignificant. So then he goes on to say, so this idea of white people and whiteness was a fairly new concept in the past couple hundred years. Then he goes on to say, but then what is whiteness? So he goes, if you go to the middle of page 22, he says, but what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it? That always, somehow, some way, silently, but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. And I kind of laugh at this because it's almost like he's being sarcastic, right? He's being sarcastic. Whiteness is everything. Whiteness is king. Amen. And he plays with religion, just like how, and criticizes religion, just like how David Walker does in his appeal to the colored citizens. He does that here. So he everything he's writing is purposeful and intentional. And so that's essentially what Du Bois is doing, is he's the first scholar to uncover and really examine and talk about historically. He didn't do it in, like, he didn't collect data, but he assessed what was going on at that time and what is going on historically to talk about whiteness and what it means to be white. And so these are the themes. The top theme of Souls of White Folks is whiteness. There's a certain type of racial discourse that is whiteness, right? And so he's really the first person to do that, even before white people did it. Also, he talks about the perceived superiority of whiteness and white society. So let's see, I think it was, top of page, well, it's 22 for me, and it's gonna be your second page in the upload. He says, this assumption that of all the hues of God, whiteness alone is inherently and obviously better than brownness or tan leads to curious acts. Okay, so he's saying that there is, again, just like appeal to the colored citizens, David Walker's appeal. If you're in my theory class, we talk about that. If not, you can read it if you want. It's up to you if you're interested in it. But talks about the same thing. Almost 100 years after David Walker did, maybe 80. So perceived superiority of whiteness and white society. This idea that white people felt they were inherently better. White folks becoming welcoming of black humility. That's another theme in this text. If we go to the middle of the third page, it's very interesting. He says, so long then as humble black folks, voluble with thanks, receive barrels of old clothes from lordly and generous whites, there is much mental peace and moral satisfaction. But when the black man begins to dispute the white man's title to certain alleged bequests of the fathers in wage and position, authority and training, and when his attitude toward charity is sullen anger rather than humble jollity, when he insists on his human right to swagger and swear and waste, then the spell is suddenly broken and the philanthropist is ready to believe that Negroes are imprudent, that the South is right, and that Japan wants to fight America. It's so interesting how Du Bois writes. He's really like, this is really a satire. He's really making jokes all throughout this writing. But basically what he's saying is, as soon as black people say, you know what, I don't want your clothes, I don't want your pity, I don't want your philanthropy, I don't need that. Because if you weren't oppressing me, I wouldn't need it. And so this idea that white folks should be praised for doing what they should be doing anyway, or what Malcolm X would say, sticking a knife 9 inches in my back and then pulling it out 3 and calling that progress. No, you can't do that. You can't expect to oppress me and then give me some crumbs and then say, oh, why aren't you happy about this? And so this is another key theme of whiteness. He's essentially showing white people who they are in the eyes of black people. This is who they are. But not only who they are here in this country, but also who they are globally. And that is that's one of the ways in which souls of white folks expands beyond in terms of the type of discussion it is with souls of black folk. Souls of black folk is typically looking at black people in the United States. It can be applied to black people elsewhere, but for most part, black people in the United States. But souls of white folk, he talks about it, and then he goes and black folks, souls of black folks kind of talks, slavery and all that. He don't really go into colonization. But souls of white folk, now he's going into colonization. Now he's talking about the United States and he's talking about Europe. And he's going hard. Okay. Hypocrisy of democracy is another thing. So if we go on the 4th page or page 24, he says, conceive this nation of all human peoples engaged in a crusade to make the world safer for democracy. Can you imagine the United States protesting against Turkish atrocities in Armenia while the Turks are silent about mobs in Chicago and St. Louis? What is Louvain compared with Memphis, Waco, Washington, Dyersburg, and Estill Springs? In short, what is the black man but America's Belgium? And how could America condemn in Germany that which she commits just as brutally within her own borders? So what he's saying is, how is the United States going to look at Germany and how they're treating the people that live there? And I don't know if he's talking about the Holocaust or anything specific, but there's some type of critique that the United States has about what German people are doing. And he's saying, but how can you look at them and say they're wrong when you're doing your own people the exact same way? There's a hypocrisy in what you call a democracy. And it's been going on for a long time. And Du Bois isn't the first to call this out. Frederick Douglass called it out, and What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And David Walker called it out 20 years before that. And I'm pretty sure somebody probably did it before that. So Du Bois is definitely not the first, but he just continues. And this idea of the hypocrisy of democracy is kind of a phrase that comes from Malcolm X's speech. And even till today, the same idea. So this is another key theme. Another theme in this reading is the hypocrisy of Christianity. So if we go to either page 26 or the 6th page, it says a nation's, wait, where are we? Oh, a nation's religion is its life, and as such, white Christianity is a miserable failure. Nor would we be unfair in this criticism. We know that we too have failed as you have, and have rejected many, a Buddha, even as you have denied Christ. But we acknowledge our human frailty, while you, claiming superhumanity, scoff endlessly at our shortcomings. Then he goes on to say, in her foreign mission work, the extraordinary self-deception of white religion is epitomized. Solemnly, the white world sends $5 million worth of missionary propaganda to Africa each year, and in the same 12 months adds $25 million worth of the vilest gin manufactured. So he says, there's not only a hypocrisy in your democracy and in your government, there's a hypocrisy in your religion. Christianity means nothing if you're not actually practicing the beliefs of fairness and equality that you preach about. It means nothing. And then you send all this money for books to try to convert people to Christianity, and then you send 5 times as much money to send alcohol. That doesn't make sense. There's a hypocrisy in your religion. It's not consistent with each other. Then he goes on, we're not going to read all of that, but he goes on to talk about colonization and capitalism. On the top of page 32, or the top of page, it might be 12 for you, it says, there's the rub. It pays. Rubber, ivory, and palm oil, tea, coffee, and cocoa, bananas, oranges, and other fruit, cotton, gold, and copper. They and 100 other things which darken sweating bodies hand up to the white world from their pits of slime, pay and pay well. But of all that the world gets, the black world gets only the pittance that the white world throws it disdainfully. So what he's saying is that within whiteness, there are these themes. And another theme is colonization and capitalism and exploitation. Taking over these so-called third world countries, taking over all of these natural resources that don't belong to one group, but they belong to everybody. And then you take them, and you sell them all over the world, and you make huge profits, and then you give a small penance back to the people that actually made it, or the people that live in the countries that make where these products come from. Yeah, this is whiteness. This is what white people look like to the rest of the world. Right? So that's what Souls of White Folks is doing. And then lastly, he concludes, he talks about this being caste system, which kind of links to Isabel Wilkerson's, if you never read her book, Caste. It's a really, really good book that recently came out. So definitely check that out. So then he goes on to say, at the very end, the last 4 sentences, he says, I hear his mighty cry reverberating through the world. I am white. Well and good, O Prometheus, divine thief. Is not the world wide enough for 2 colors, for many little shinings of the sun? Why then devour your own vitals if I answer even as proudly, I am black? So what he's saying is that the world is big enough and rich enough for more than one empowered group. There's nothing wrong with you being white. I have no problem with you being white. I have no problem with you looking out for people that look like you. My problem is that being the essence of my destruction, of the destruction of my people. Is this world not big enough for everybody to partake, and for everybody to be rich, and for everybody to be wealthy, and for every group to be represented in power, and for everything to be equal? The world has more than enough resources for that. So he kind of ends it because the whole essay, again, he's writing to white people because most people of any other race would not be, and he's writing to scholarly white people, academic white people, may not be able to understand what he's saying, but it sounds very much anti-white. So he kind of leaves it at the very end to say, I'm not saying I have a problem with white people. I don't. I just have a problem with the things that you do and the exploitation and the capitalism and the colonization of all of these other groups of people that leave them in disarray while you and your people are continuing to expand and continue to stay in power. It's just not fair. And it's not right, and it's not necessary, because the earth is big enough for everybody to partake, and the resources are grand enough for everybody to partake. And so that's essentially what Du Bois is doing in whiteness. And whiteness is important when we're talking about racial discourse and racial dialogue, number one, because it is a part of the race discourse, but number two, because this is actually, again, Du Bois is one of the first, well, the first scholar really to assess race in this way. So you can't have, you shouldn't have a race class without first discussing Du Bois, particularly Souls of Black folk, and then if you want to, Souls of White folk. So another assignment that you have, discussion board, what you're going to do is you're going to visit the discussion board on Canvas, and you're going to create a post answering the questions below. Afterwards, you will respond to another student's post, and you will be graded on if you answer the questions and how well you answer the questions. And you will also be graded on the substance of your response to another student's post. Your deadline for both of these posts is September 6th, 1 p.m. So again, this is August 30th through the September 3rd lectures. And then that following Monday, I think that's Labor Day, that is when this is due at 1 p.m. And so you are going to answer the questions. What were some of the key differences in the way Du Bois talked to and about Black folks, and how he talked to and about white folks? And based on how Du Bois felt about World War I and European colonialism, how do you think he would have responded to President Biden's recent exit plan out of Afghanistan? And I want you to use info from Souls of White folk to answer this question. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And now we will go into our last reading, which is systemic, or our last reading, which is Racist America, where we talk about systemic racism. All right, so Racist America. Joe Fagan does a really good job in this text of basically breaking down why race continues to be an issue in the United States. And what he does here is he does a historical analysis of race, and he looks at the early documents of the United States. Some people just say America. The US documents, Constitution, history, and does this analysis of how race plays a role in the creation of this country. To answer the question why it is something that continues to be brought up in conversation, why it continues to be an issue. It's been decades after, this was in the 90s, so it's been decades after the civil rights movement. Why are we still talking about this? Why is race still something that is a problem in American society? So Fagan says, well, we'll take it all the way back to the beginning. And what he finds in his research, and Joe Fagan is a sociologist, but he's kind of a historian in this text, but does a really good job. His overall argument is that race is an issue in the United States because it's part of the foundation of America. America's foundation is based on race and racism. And so what he does is, number one, he problematizes this idea that race was only an issue in one region. When people think about especially the history of race and even race and racism now, what they end up saying or arguing is that, oh, well, that's a South thing. People in the South, those Southerners, they're racist down there. They got the Republicans, the conservatives, it's the Bible Belt, they're racist. And Northerners, now they're more liberal. They're liberal, they're Democrats, blah, blah, blah. That's this idea. And Fagan is like, no, let's not do that. Because if we go all the way back to history, we see that race and racism is a thing everywhere in all parts of the United States, and still to this day. He says for a large part of the colonial times, the Northerners and Southerners, they were both pro-slavery. The Southerners, of course, had the labor, but the Northerners profited off of it. And then the Northerners sold the goods that they got from the raw materials from the enslaved people back to the Southerners. So the Southerners were making money off of the labor, and then they were spending money on the goods. And then Northerners were making money because they were selling those goods back to the South and selling them all over the world. It was a win-win for everybody except for Black people. And so this issue of slavery and white racism, white supremacy, white domination is something that goes beyond region. It's not regional. And so he also looks at the Constitutional Convention. And he also looks at the Declaration of Independence. He also looks at the Constitution. And he says, when we look at these early documents, we see this notion of property. Now, they don't talk explicitly about slavery in these early documents. Why? Because it was seen as something that was archaic. It was actually kind of a shame. Most times, particularly of that time, the United States didn't really want to say that they were practicing slavery. And this was like the 1700s. This is fairly modern. Slavery dates all the way back to biblical ancient times. Y'all still doing slavery? People are letting that go. And they're practicing it well into the 1800s. So it's almost kind of like, not to mention it's wrong. And they knew it was morally wrong. So they don't mention slavery in these early documents, but what they do talk about is property. And they say property is the main object of society. And just like there are other words that people may use in a way to speak negatively of a certain group, you may not use a racial derogatory term, but you might use another term that is synonymous with that. That's kind of what property was. Property is another way of saying slave. And so property, capital, the fact that these people were considered property is the main object of society. And so in this in this context, freedom is being able to protect one's property and anything that produces a profit. And so some people argue that this is, well, Fagan argues that this is the main point and the main object of why the United States creates policies that continue to protect property, that continue to allow for freedoms and disadvantages of certain groups. So property is the main object of society. And even those people who oppose slavery, even those people who oppose that certain human beings should not be considered property, they did it on the basis of morality. They did not do it on the basis of morality and humanity. But the reason why a lot of people oppose, some people who did oppose slavery, some people who were anti-slavery, they were anti-slavery because they felt that it would harm the defense of the nation. In essence, they said that it would contribute to the laziness of poor white people. So their argument was, if we need to fight the British again, if we need to fight the French, we need to fight the Germans, if we need to fight the Spanish, if we need to fight any group of people, we need to have strong men to represent us on the battlefield. They need to be strong, they need to be alert, they need to be ready to protect the nation. And the only people that are working, the strongest people in our society right now are not white people, because they're not working. They have a whole race of people working for them. So it sounds good now, but when it's time to defend the nation, they're not going to be ready to handle themselves on that battlefield. And they're not going to be ready to defend us because they'll be out of shape. So maybe we should reconsider this slavery thing, because we definitely don't want black people defending the nation, because now they're going to think they're human. Now they're going to think that they should be respected because they fought for the country, and kind of so. So we don't want them fighting for us. We need to have white men fighting for us, but they can't be lazy. So what are we going to do? Never did they say, you know what, maybe that's just wrong. Maybe slavery is just not, no, we don't care about that part. We care about how it affects white people. So the centeredness, white centeredness, was a key theme for anti-slavery sentiments in early colonial times. Then later on, you know, kind of shifted a little bit. But that was a major thing. And a lot of times, American colonists felt like being taxed by the British was similar to slavery, but they did not see how the enslavement of Africans were any different. But why was that? Because they believed in what they call natural law. And it was this belief that there were some groups that were naturally meant to be inferior. And they used this idea, this principle, to justify the enslavement of Africans, to justify the genocide of Native Americans, and to justify the subordination of women. So this idea of natural law said, well, this is different from what we were going through in Britain, because we're not supposed to live that way, but these people are. And then Fagan also argues that anti-Black racism, slavery, was part of the foundation for the democracy. Even if we just look at the people. He says, if we look at the presidents before the Civil War, 10 US presidents, the founder of American Psychiatry and the founder of Quakers, which was a very early liberal religious organization, all participated in owning Black Americans at that time. They all participated in the system of slavery. Not only that, but the 3/5 Compromise, saying that African people in the South were 3/5 of a human being. Fugitive Slave Act, all of these were policies that were created to maintain racism. And then even Lincoln said at one point, he said he would make slavery permanent if that means he didn't have to go to war. If I didn't have to go to war, you can keep them. Later on, he would change his mind, but that's what he said while he was president. So the basis of the American structure was founded on racist ideologies. Right? It's founded on racist ideologies and people who practice racism. And the eradication of slavery did not go away or the eradication of slavery did not do away with this kind of thought because it just translated into a different form. It went from slavery to now white supremacy, white domination, white racism. A lot of people spoke out, a lot of people, and particularly some white people, spoke out against slavery, but very few spoke out against white supremacy. They said, well, we shouldn't practice slavery, but it doesn't mean that white people aren't inherently better than black people. That idea didn't become archaic until probably the middle part of the 20th century. However, some argue that slavery and racism was so normal at the time that it would be unfair to judge these people, right, white people particularly, or label them racist because it was a part of their everyday life. Some people say it's not fair, that's just who they were, that's just the time that they lived in. If people judged me during the time I lived, it wouldn't be unfair to judge me a certain way. And while some people may agree and some people may not, we go to the next slide. That's not really what Fagan is getting at with this. What he's getting at is it's not just about whether these people are right or wrong, because they're dead, it's over now. There's nothing we can do. We're talking about the system that they created that continues this inequality. The problem is not racist words or racist thoughts, it's the system that keeps people in an inferior position. It's the systematization of racism. So what is systemic racism? It's the diverse assortment of racist practices, unjustly gained economic and political power of whites, the continuing resource of inequalities, and the white racial ideologies, attitudes, and institutions that are created to preserve white advantages and power. See, even at this time, many white people disagreed with slavery or the slave trade, but most white people either participated in slavery or the slave trade or did not object to it. And some that did not feel it was immoral for Black people because of the amount of uprisings, and also because it made white people lazy. So most white Americans still see this time period as a mistake that was made and not a part of the nation's foundation. But if we look at systemic racism, we see that these unjustly gained economic and political power of whites, because white women couldn't vote and Black people couldn't vote, anybody who came in power during that time, it was unjust. Economic power, the entire country's wealth was built off of slave labor. And individual families' wealth came out of slave labor. Then the continuing resource of inequalities through Jim Crow, through segregation, through mass incarceration, through concentrated poverty. All of these things continue the inequalities, and they create white racist ideas, white racist attitudes, and these people then go on to create and or maintain institutions that essentially preserve white advantage and power, and it just starts the cycle all over again. This is why Joe Fagan says this is a system. This is systemic racism. And those who dominate the economic system and create the political system, create the religious, legal, media, family, educational systems, all of this is linked to white domination, slavery, and slave polity, and it was all based on white on Black domination. This is what Fagan is arguing. So he's showing that when we keep talking about race and discussing race and seeing acts of racism, that's because it's a part of the foundation of America. He goes on to say that dehumanization is the psychological dynamic of systemic racism. The reason why racism continues to exist is because most people don't see these groups as human. They don't see them as human beings. They see them as subhuman, or they separate the humanity from them. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, he says the worker is separated from his or her work. That's how they're dehumanized. I don't care about the employee. I only care about what they can do for me. In a sexist society, women are separated from control over their own life choices. I care about the woman's body and the pleasure that it brings me or what can be done with it, but I don't care about the woman herself. In racism, people of color lose control over inalienable rights, human rights, and identity. I don't care about the person. I care about what they can do for me. And then that's it. But they're not the same as me. And so this becomes the foundation for biological racism. How can you say all men are created equal, but then all men are not created equal? No, I mean, all men are created equal. I just don't see these people as men. So you take away the humanity, you fail to see them as human, you fail to see them as men and women, then it's easier to pass unfair immigration laws. It's easier to overlook police brutality. It's easier to overlook poor housing in schools. It's easier to overlook lynching and other racialized social problems. Why? Because you don't see them as human beings in the first place. So then the question is then asked, the idea is, well, that was back in the past. It's over now. It's done with. Well, Civil War wasn't that long ago. 1865, 1965, 30, 40, 50, I guess 150 odd years or so, something like that, 50, 60. Not that long. If you look at a historical timeline, it'll be about that long from each other. Not the ones you see in your history books, a real historical timeline. 160 years is like that. It's not that long ago. America's a very young country. And most of its time as a country developing was spent enslaving and oppressing, particularly this group of people. So the effects of this racist foundation is not something that happened in the past and it's over, because it did things that people benefit from today. It stimulated the American economy. Why is the United States so rich? Why is the United States a superpower? It started off with free labor. China is the richest country in the world that was not started off with slave labor. The United States is rich because of hundreds and hundreds of years of free labor. It stimulated the economy. Just, it is what it is. Not only that, it provided for generational wealth. It allowed for personal people to be wealthy. If you read The Hidden Cost of Being African American, Oliver Shapiro talks about that. Okay. And so with generational wealth, if you were to ask enough white people the right questions, and if you were to do your research, you might find that a lot of white people made money either by owning Black people or by participating or benefiting from that system. Another effect of this racist foundation is colorblind racism, and the fact that now we may not have Jim Crow racism segregation, but we do have another form of it, which is called colorblind racism. We'll talk more about that later on in the semester, and Bonilla Silva's theory, colorblind racism. And then you also have internalized oppression, which is the way in which this racist foundation and its effects have now permeated into people of color, and it causes them to now perpetuate these same ideas among each other, i.e. light skin versus dark skin, i.e. men versus women, i.e. gay people versus straight people within the same racial group. So it causes internalized oppression as well as external oppression from outside groups. So these are the effects of this racist foundation, and this is what Fagan is arguing. He's saying, and this is why racism continues to be a problem in American society and US society, because it's not just it's not just a mistake. It's actually a part of the country's fabric. It's a part of who the United States is. It's a part of their actual identity. It's a part of their genetic makeup. Ooh, that's a nice way to bring this all back together. Race is a part of that genetic makeup. Racism is a part of the genetic makeup. Just like your genetics, you can't change genes. That's just how you are. That's who you were born. That's the genes. And the only way that can be done from an institutional standpoint, if you read Fagan, is you got to rebuild. You got to start and rebuild. It's just like the foundation of a house. If you purchase a house that has a rocky foundation, you could build walls, you can build a new roof, you can paint it, you can make it look as beautiful as you want. But every couple of years, something's going to happen to show you, oh, I forgot that foundation in that house is rocky. It may lean, something may happen, and it may show you, oh, the foundation is not good. Eventually, you're just going to have to either sell it or tear the house down and rebuild it. That's Fagan's argument. So these are your lectures for the week. You could listen to them all at once, or you can listen to them, listen to some at one point and then some at another point. However you want to do it, it's up to you. Make sure you do the assignments that I went over. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or feel free to come to my office hours, and I'll be open to answering any questions you may have. Some of you send me messages on Canvas. I'll read those as well, and I'll respond to those as well, but email is always better. So feel free to do that. And with that being said, I hope you have a great week. I hope you have a great weekend. Have a safe holiday. And you'll see me next week, and hopefully I'll see you in office hours.